Imagine carrying 20 kilograms of poison every single day. Not in a bottle, not in a BL, but wrapped in silk, pressed against your skin, brushing your throat. Floating in the air you breathe. You wake up, you dress, you step outside, and slowly, silently, it begins to kill you. This was not imagination. This was real life for women living in the time of the Victorian era. A world that looked elegant from a distance, but hid something far darker underneath. Their dresses were not just uncomfortable. They were not simply heavy or impractical. They were dangerous. And the most disturbing truth was not the poison itself, but the fact that people suspected something was wrong, and still, nothing stopped. Factories kept running. Money kept flowing. And society kept smiling. London in 1860 looked like a dream at first glance. Streets filled with women moving like living sculptures, their dresses wide and flowing, forming perfect bell shapes that seemed almost unreal. From far away it looked beautiful, almost magical. But step closer and the illusion began to crack. These dresses were massive, heavy, sometimes weighing as much as 20 kilograms, layer upon layer of fabric, steel, and decoration. Getting dressed was not a simple task. It was a process that required time and help. No woman could do it alone. First came the soft cotton layer against the skin, the only protection between the body and everything that followed. Then came the undergarments, tied carefully, and then the corset, the most painful part of all, pulled tight from the back, slowly at first, then harder, squeezing the waist smaller and smaller, forcing the ribs inward, making breathing difficult. Doctors warned about it. They spoke of damage, of organs being compressed, of fainting. But fashion did not listen. And then came the invention that changed everything. The crinoline, a cage made of steel hoops that expanded outward, creating the famous wide dress shape without adding too much weight. It allowed dresses to grow larger than ever before, some reaching nearly 2 meters in width. Women were no longer just wearing clothes. They were carrying structures, walking carefully, learning how to sit, how to pass through doors, how to move without losing balance. Even the wind became dangerous, lifting the dress suddenly, exposing the legs, turning elegance into embarrassment. But the greatest danger was fire. Victorian homes were filled with open flames, candles, fireplaces, lamps, and the crinoline acted like a chimney. If the fabric caught fire, the flames would rise instantly, trapping the wearer inside. Newspapers recorded tragedy after tragedy. Young women burned in seconds. Others dragged in accidents when their dresses caught in wheels or objects. Thousands died. And still, the fashion did not stop, because behind all of this, there was profit. Huge profit. Dresses required large amounts of fabric. Wealthy women changed outfits multiple times a day. Factories produced more and more. And then came a discovery that made everything even bigger. In 1856, a young chemist named William Henry Perkin created the first synthetic dye, a bright purple color that changed the textile industry forever. Colors became stronger, brighter, easier to produce, and soon new shades filled the markets. Among them, one color became especially popular, a bright, rich green that looked alive, fresh, and luxurious. But this color carried a deadly secret. The green dye used in many of these dresses contained arsenic, a powerful poison, first developed by Carl Wilhelm Scheele. It was beautiful and long-lasting, which made it perfect for fashion, and so it spread everywhere. Wallpaper, decorations, toys, and most importantly, clothing. Women loved it, society admired it, and the industry profited from it. But no one told the truth. A single dress could contain enough arsenic to cause serious harm, sometimes even death. And yet it was sold like any other product soon. Strange illnesses began appearing. Women complained of headaches, nausea, burning skin wounds where the fabric touched their bodies. Their hair began to fall out. Their strength faded. But doctors did not understand. They blamed stress, nerves, or simple weakness. The real cause remained hidden, or perhaps ignored. But inside the factories where the dye was made, the truth was impossible to miss. Workers breathed in arsenic dust every day. It covered their skin, entered their lungs, and slowly destroyed their bodies. Many became weak. Some lost fingernails. Others died within months, but they continued working because they had no other choice. Then finayi, Science began to reveal the truth. A chemist named August Wilhelm von Hofmann discovered that fabrics dyed with arsenic could release toxic vapor, especially in warm conditions. This meant that when a woman wore a green dress in a crowded room, she might actually be breathing poison. The evidence was clear. The danger was real. But the response from the industry was silence. No warnings, no changes. Just quiet continuation. Because stopping meant losing money, and profit was more important than safety. Silence can sometimes be more dangerous than lies, because when no one speaks, nothing changes. And by the 1860s, the silence surrounding poisonous fashion had already caused too much damage. The signs were everywhere. People were getting sick. Families were suffering. Workers were dying. But the system continued to protect itself. The industry had grown too powerful, too profitable to stop. Easily, doctors began to notice patterns that could not be ignored. Entire families falling ill at the same time, suffering from vomiting, weakness, strange symptoms that did not match known diseases. One physician, Thomas Orton, decided to investigate more closely. He examined homes, food, water, everything, until he noticed something unusual. Bright green wallpaper covering the walls, the same color that had become so fashionable in dresses. He collected samples and studied them, and what he found was shocking. The wallpaper was releasing arsenic dust into the air, poisoning the people living inside those homes. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly the danger was no longer hidden. It was visible, undeniable. Newspapers began reporting the truth. People started asking questions. If wallpaper could poison families, what about dresses? What about the fabric touching the skin every day? But even then, the response from businesses remained careful and controlled. They avoided direct answers. They offered vague reassurances, claiming there was no clear proof of danger. But the fear had already begun to spread. The turning point came with a tragic death that shocked the public. A young worker named Mathilda Schura, only 19 years old, died from severe arsenic poisoning after working with green dye. Her symptoms were horrifying: vomiting, pain, weakness, suffering that lasted 4 days before her death. Newspapers described it in detail, and suddenly the truth became impossible to ignore. People began to see the connection between beauty and danger. Reform movements started to grow. Groups questioned the entire idea of fashion that harmed the body. They asked simple but powerful questions. Why should women wear clothing that restricts movement, that damages health, that risks death? Doctors joined the discussion, publishing studies about the effects of corsets, about breathing problems, about long-term damage. The pressure was building, but change did not come. Israeli manufacturers defended themselves. Some claimed the amount of arsenic used was safe. Others dismissed the warnings as exaggeration, using words like hysteria to reduce concern. But this time, the voices against them were stronger. Scientists, doctors, and even parts of the public were demanding answers. And slowly, governments began to act. Countries like France and Germany started banning arsenic in certain products, and eventually, restrictions reached Britain as well. At the same time, fashion itself began to change, not because of morality, but because of opportunity. New dyes were developed that did not rely on arsenic. New styles replaced the massive crinoline. Dresses became smaller, more practical, shifting towards new shapes that required different materials and designs. By the late 1860s, the era of the giant crinoline was ending. Not because society suddenly cared, but because the industry found a new way to profit. New trends, new products, new ways to sell. The system had simply evolved, leaving behind the most dangerous elements once they became a risk to business. And that is the real story behind Victorian fashion, not just elegance and beauty, but profit, pressure, and silent danger. Women did not always choose these clothes freely. They were influenced by society, by expectations, by the desire to belong. And in that process, they became part of a system that valued appearance over safety. The story of these dresses is not just history. It is a warning, because the same pattern can appear again, in different forms, in different industries. Whenever profit becomes more important than people, the question remains the same. How much risk will be ignored? And how long will silence last before the truth finally forces change? And even after the truth began to spread, something strange happened. Not everyone stopped wearing the dangerous colors. Some women hesitated, but many continued. Because fashion was not just about clothing. It was about identity. It was about status. It was about being seen. In the world of the Victorian era, appearance was everything. A woman's dress could define her place in society without her saying a single word. The size of her gown, the tightness of her waist, the brightness of her colors. All of it sent a message. And green, that dangerous, shimmering green, was one of the most powerful messages of all. It meant wealth. It meant modern taste. It meant that you could afford the latest fashion. So, even as rumors spread, even as doctors warned, even as newspapers began to question, many chose to ignore it. Because the fear of social exclusion was stronger than the fear of slow poison, and the industry understood this perfectly. They did not need to force anyone. They only needed to create desire, and desire would do the rest. Inside the great cities of Europe, the fashion machine continued to grow. Factories worked day and night. Workers mixed chemicals, dyed fabrics, cut materials, stitched garments. Everything moved faster than ever before. More dresses, more colors, more profit. But hidden behind this growth was a human cost that few people ever saw. Inside the dye factories, conditions were unbearable. The air was thick with toxic dust. Workers breathed it in with every second. Their skin absorbed it. Their bodies weakened. Some developed constant coughing. Others lost control of their hands. Many became too sick to continue. But still they stayed, because leaving meant losing income. And losing income meant hunger. So they kept working, even when they knew it was killing them. This was the silent sacrifice behind the beauty of Victorian fashion. The elegance seen on the streets was built on suffering hidden behind factory walls. One inspector, visiting a dye factory in the early 1860s, described what he saw as something deeply disturbing. Workers moved slowly, their faces pale, their eyes tired. Some had open sores on their skin. Others struggled to stand. And yet, production continued as if nothing was wrong, because stopping the machines meant stopping the money. And stopping the money was not an option. At the same time, a new kind of awareness was beginning to rise. People were starting to question things. Not just the dyes, but the entire idea of fashion itself. Why should clothing be so heavy? Why should it restrict movement? Why should it cause pain? Why should it be dangerous? These questions slowly gave birth to reform movements. Groups began to speak openly against the extreme styles of the time. They argued that clothing should be practical, that it should allow freedom of movement, that it should not harm the body. Among these voices were early feminists and social reformers who saw fashion as part of a larger problem. The corset was not just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of control, a symbol of expectation, a symbol of a society that valued appearance over comfort, and sometimes, even over life. Doctors added their voices as well. They published reports. They described cases. They explained the physical damage caused by tight corsets. They showed how organs were compressed, how breathing was restricted, how long-term health was affected. But even with all this evidence, change was slow, because fashion was not driven by logic. It was driven by culture, and culture does not change idly. Still, something had shifted. The idea that fashion could be dangerous was now part of public conversation. And once an idea enters the public mind, it is difficult to remove. Customers began asking questions. Shopkeepers became more careful. Manufacturers started to feel pressure, and where there is pressure, there is eventually change. At the same time, science continued to move forward. New dyes were being developed. Safer alternatives began to appear. Colors that were just as bright, but without the deadly arsenic. For the industry, this was an opportunity, a way to continue selling without the growing fear. And so, slowly, the transition began. Green did not disappear overnight, but it began to lose its power. Its appeal faded. Its danger became part of its identity, and customers started to turn away. Fashion itself also began to evolve. The massive crinoline, once the symbol of elegance, started to shrink. Designs became more controlled, more structured, less extreme. By the late 1860s, a new style emerged, the bustle. Instead of spreading fabric in a full circle, it concentrated volume at the back. This made movement easier. It reduced the risks associated with wide skirts, and it created a new look that felt modern. But once again, this change was not purely about safety. It was about business. The new styles required different materials, different construction, more detail, more labor, which meant more profit. By the 1870s, the age of the giant crinoline had ended, and with it, one of the most dangerous chapters in fashion history began to fade. But the story does not end there, because the lesson remains. Victorian fashion was not simply about beauty. It was about systems. Systems of production, systems of influence, systems of profit. Women were not just wearing dresses. They were participating in an industry that shaped their choices, often without them realizing it. Looking back today, it is easy to judge, to wonder how people could ignore such obvious danger. But the truth is more complicated, because the same patterns still exist, in different forms, in different industries. Even in modern fashion, products are still marketed as beautiful, as desirable, as necessary, and sometimes the true cost remains hidden behind supply chains, behind factories, behind silence. The story of arsenic dresses is not just about the past. It is about human behavior, about how comfort can be sacrificed for appearance, about how quickly danger can be ignored when profit is involved, and about how silence can allow harm to continue far longer than it should. In the end, Victorian fashion did not change because people suddenly became more moral. It changed because the system adapted, because new solutions became available, because the risk to profit became too high, and that is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all, because it forces us to ask a question that still matters today. If something dangerous is profitable, how long will it continue before it is finally stopped? And who will pay the price in the meantime? That is the real story behind those beautiful dresses. Not elegance, not romance, but risk, silence, and survival.